I've always heard voices and had visions from a very young age. And for a long time, I had no idea why that was happening. And then eventually ended up in psychiatric care, both of the traditional kind and of the sort of medical kind. Um, but in terms of coming into working in mental health, it is really through the women's movement. So in my early 20s, I was actively participating in the women's movement based in Hyderabad. And I was also doing my PhD in cultural studies. So in a way I was training to be a researcher, but then I sort of moved more and more into looking at representations of madness in popular cinema. My PhD was on popular cinema, so in that way I kind of started looking at it, got more and more interested in representations, and then that eventually turned into actual survivor-led research in terms of creating knowledge about madness, which is not from the so-called experts who are psychiatrists, etc., and what we as people who have experienced what we call madness could add to that knowledge base. So that's how, well, I've always been a researcher, but I kind of moved track from films to studying madness, I suppose. Yeah. There's one tradition of user survivor research which is very personal in the sense that people use their own stories, which is called the narrative research, which I have also done. But I tend not to do too much of that. What I tend to do is to use my personal experience, and by personal I also mean the political collective experience, or not just my experience, to inform how we ask questions while doing research. So in that sense, it is more about bringing personal and political experience into defining or designing the research, and what methods to use and what questions to ask, and how you actually represent that, what you find from that, in what mode. So it's more methodological rather than bringing. I tend to very rarely talk about my own personal experience of madness in the. I suppose in initial years I did speak a little bit, but I tend to speak much less of that nowadays. So we designed a research project which was specifically looking at Black women's experiences of recovering from mental distress. So the question we asked is not about what's your recovery journey. What we asked is, what do you understand by your distress? How do you define it? How do you make sense of it? So once you ask that question, then you can ask people, how do you then live with it or work with it? So we are not going in with a recovery narrative. We ask, so there's people who understood their distress in terms of it's a mental illness model. There are people who completely believe that it is not an illness, it is a socially created, it's a socially constructed thing. And there are other people who understood it as a spiritual breakthrough. So there's different positions come through. So I think what I found is that you cannot talk about recovery unless you actually ask the question about how do a person understand and define their mental distress, and then you can ask the questions about how do they work with it. Do they call it recovery, or do they just call it part of being who they are, etc. So I found that research really interesting, and also because we trained up and we had a 5-member team, all Black women, all survivors, and we interviewed about 22 women, but we were also interviewed. So there was no divide between being a researcher and the subject. So the researcher's story also became part of the overall story, and I think that's probably one of my favorite pieces of work. I don't know if you listened to my talk in the morning. I've been part of the Black Survivor movement for quite a while, and one of the things that we find in being part of the minority communities in the UK is that we don't really get invited into international forums like INTAR, like the Hearing Voices network, etc. This one was different. I think it is probably because it was organized in India, organized by Bapu Trust, and there is a very clear agenda here through the TCI Asia network, etc., for real transcultural dialogue. So then, the kind of the Western or the high income international survivors coming in, maybe for the first time got a little bit shifted that, within those high income countries, there are minoritized and marginalized communities. And I think we got a chance to, me and my colleagues, to come here. So this is my first time in this kind of an alternative international forum. I've been to lots and lots of conferences, but usually it will be either sort of one or two people in the room in a very wide audience, or it will be very specifically about race and mental health. So that's been quite interesting. I am not a reformist, I am an abolitionist. But I can understand in particular, but I'm also a very contextual person. So there will be contexts in which people may think that using some bits of the medical model may be required. But aspiration for me would always be to completely get rid of the medical model and look to social, political, and cultural ways in which we understand and we work with madness. So for example, if people are hearing voices and it's not really causing them distress, do we really need to treat them? Can't we just have people? Because if we have seers and Sufis, we are happy with them. They hear voices and they speak to God and whatever else. But when it comes to an ordinary person, if the voices are causing them distress, we might, they will require support. But we don't, like, by definition need to get rid of voices. It's just part of the human experience. So I think where support is required, in my experience, there are ways in which you can support a person even without actually having to give medication. And from all my understanding of the existing research, medication doesn't really cure you of any of this. It just suppresses it, or I don't know.